We're super lucky this morning to have the face of 70-20-10, Charles Jennings, with us. And Charles is the co-founder of the 70-20-10 Institute. I have known, and I've been fortunate enough to know Charles for many years, and not only is he like the consummate gentleman, but the work that he does is so rooted in kind of like proper research and proper design. So it's always a pleasure to hear his insights. This morning, Charles is going to be talking about a topic that says that the future is learning from work. So Charles, thank you for making the trip, and thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. 16 years ago, I was invited to take on the role as Chief Learning Officer for Reuters. Reuters, at the time, was the largest multimedia information company in the world, an august 150-year-old institution. The company spent huge amounts of money on developing its people. It had a long culture of innovation. In fact, Reuters was founded by Paul Julius Reuter, who founded it on the basis of disruptive technology. His disruptive technology was 47 carrier pigeons that he purchased, got an agent in Brussels to be able to carry the end-of-day trading reports from the Brussels Bourse to the good businessman of Aachen in Germany, where he lived at the time, and found that the carrier pigeons could cover that journey in about half the time of a man on a horse. Reuter did that for 2 years, realized that a new technology was about to overtake his carrier pigeons, and that was the telegraph. Came to London, established Reuters in London, and the rest is really history. But I came into Reuters 16 years ago as Chief Learning Officer with a challenge to make the company more effective. In fact, the company at the time was about to go out of business. We spent more than $100 million on training. We engaged with more than 3,000 training suppliers, and yet there was not a great deal to show for it. So I looked at various options I had in terms of what could we do that was innovative and different. And I came across some work that had been done back in the 1980s, and that actually Goldman Sachs had done a little bit of work on it. And it was around a model which said, actually, when we look at high performance, when we look at people who are exemplary performers, they learn most of what they need to know. What got them there was not from sitting in classrooms or going through e-learning modules. It was actually from doing the work. It was learning from experience and practice. So I then built a strategy around these ideas, around this 70-20-10, and there's a lot of misconceptions about this model. People, I've given up having those discussions, but people talk about, well, is it exactly 70, is it exactly 10, in terms of people learn from experience and practice, they learn from other people, and they learn from structured learning programs. And the answer is, well, of course, it's not. It's all contextual. Learning is deeply contextual. But the point is, we learn most of what we need to know by doing work. And what I want to talk about for the next 15 minutes or so is really around that. And the challenge I think we have is that we focus too much on learning. One of the other things I said in my time as Chief Learning Officer was, actually, I wasn't terribly interested in learning, but I was passionate about performance. Because learning is one way in which we can improve organizational performance. And if nothing else, those of us in the room, most of us in the room, who are either involved in developing technologies or approaches, or whether we're chief learning officers or chief talent officers or whatever, our focus is to help people do their jobs better. It's no more complex than that. If we can help people do their jobs better in their teams, their organizations will perform better than their competitors and so on. So I think that when we look at organizational performance, maybe we've been focusing on the wrong things. And it's understandable to a certain extent, because we all have grown up in a world based on actually an 18th century construct of something called the curriculum, which was developed by the Prussian military picked up by an American, brought to this country, spread throughout the world, this idea that we created some structure and put people through a process, and once they'd finished, they can go off and be effective at what they do. That maybe worked fine for the Prussian military in the 18th century. We might not call it the curriculum these days, we might call them learning journeys or learning paths and whatever, but actually they're firmly rooted in the 18th century. And I would challenge that they're not really appropriate for the 21st century. So I think that when we look at organizational performance, we're maybe starting in the wrong place. We're thinking about we need to help people to learn in order to work, rather than how can we exploit the opportunities that we have every day of our working lives to learn from what we do. And of course the answer isn't quite as black and white as that, because we sometimes need to know the fundamentals. If I move into a new role, I need to know what's expected of me, how I'm going to be measured. I need to know those basic things. But again, I came into Reuters, our onboarding programs lasted 3 months. Sometimes 3 months for job roles, jobs where people, the average time that people spent in those jobs was 20 months. Absolute craziness. So, this was said to me by my colleague Jos Arets at the Institute just a couple of weeks ago, and we were having a conversation. He said this, and I said, "Where did you hear that?" He said, "Oh, that's part of the new book, that my component of the new book I'm writing." And I think it's so true. Learning is actually an intelligent byproduct of continuous improvement in organizations. We need to start to think differently about that. We need to flip. We need to think about learning from work, in other words, working in order to learn and having that virtuous circle, rather than simply learning in order to work. That also changes our focus. It changes our focus from learning to performance and productivity. And productivity is really important at every level of our world. If you take, for example, looking at research around productivity, and I think it's best for us to look outside of our world of learning experts and HR experts, and look at what economists are saying, and macroeconomic theory says about learning and work. And I think this is Paul Krugman, who's a Nobel Prize winning economist, says productivity is not everything, but in the long run it's pretty well everything. And actually, if something is pretty well everything, it's pretty important. And when we look at the data at labour productivity, and I apologise, spelt in the British English spelling of labour, but the OECD data on labour productivity tells us a story. It tells us that over the last 50 or 60 years, the increase in labour productivity, well, the rate of increase of labour productivity has decreased. Now, actually, a 3% increase in labour productivity means that the quality of life, the living standard, doubles once a generation. Once that drops to where it is now, and this is for the US, for the data that the OECD collects is from the US, from the original 15 countries in the EU and Japan, that's now bottomed out about 1%, which means that living standards double every 3 generations, and in the interim, lots of people suffer. As we saw the image earlier on of the people living on the streets in San Francisco, and I'm off to Denver, Colorado tonight, and having been there, I know I'll see the same thing, and you go almost anywhere in the world, and we see this incredible challenge and problem. So despite all our technologies, despite all our new approaches, in terms of labour productivity, and actually folks, the only way we're going to improve standards of living is we have more people to do the work, or we do the work smarter. Therefore, labour productivity increases. This is the only thing that we can rely on. We're not doing terribly well. And also, as was said by Rob in the opening presentation this morning, what got us here will not get us there. And a new book that I'm working on with my colleagues, with Jos and my colleagues at the Institute, we're looking at new models for learning and development, new business models, moving from operational to strategic, from focus on learning to focus on business, and moving from a responsive, order-taking type models up to real value created. Because there are opportunities in our field to create great value. Thinking about that in a little more depth, a man called Andreas de Grip, who's a professor of economics at Maastricht University, has been doing a longitudinal study across Europe, looking at how organizations improve and how learning occurs. And de Grip says, he doesn't say 70-20-10, he says 98%, well, over 95% of learning that occurs is informal. And all learning in the workplace isn't equal. De Grip's data shows that some things, such as new and challenging activities, cooperating with more experienced colleagues, working with exemplary performers, those are the things that really improve performance. And in fact, I've just written and about to publish a paper with a man called Joachim Nisgaard, who until recently was the head of talent, the global head of talent for the well-named Dong Energy, Danish oil and natural gas. Dong is actually the largest manufacturer of offshore wind farms in the world. And what Nisgaard and I did was that we designed a bit of research to look at, within that company, to look at what it was that made high performers high performers. And strangely, the results that came from that work were very, very similar to de Grip. The development experiences with lasting impact were increasing job scope, new initiatives, having a role model, being thrown in to fix it and turn around. And also those things, the ones with the little asterisk beside them, they were correlated when we correlated them against the performance data of people in the organization. They were correlated with high performance as well. In other words, high performers, when we look at the data, high performers become high performers by being challenged, by having good networks, by reflecting on what they do, and in other ways. So how that fits into the 70-20-10 approach, and many, many organizations across the world are now using this approach, is it provides us with a framework to step out away from the idea that we learn in order to work, to step away from the idea that we learn through courses and programs, to have that program mindset, to be able to step out and say, okay, what else can we do to help people do their jobs better? And the answer to that is, we can do a number of things. And 70-20-10 is, first of all, it's a methodology. And at the Institute, we have a methodology that's based on, based around 5 roles. And the roles are all performance-based. There's the performance detective, which carries out a thorough analysis, a business analysis, a task analysis, a performance analysis, in terms of understanding what it is people are doing and what they need to do. There's a performance architect who architects solutions to improve performance, to improve outputs in the organization. There's a master builder that can build solutions as a game changer, that makes sure that those solutions are embedded in the culture of the organizations. And we've been working with companies like Citibank over the last few years that are doing great things. Citibank have moved from the concept of courses to campaigns. So they've moved out of that straitjacket of, yes, you need to attend a course on this, to we have a campaign and a series of challenges where we're going to get you to engage in as part of your work in order to improve your performance. 70-20-10 is also a model. It helps us move out of this straitjacket of individual performance, because I would challenge anyone in the room here that you achieve your objectives each year alone. Of course, we all work in teams, we work in multiple teams all the time. And yet, much of our learning is based around us as individuals. Whereas 70-20-10, when implemented well, it moves us up to look at organizational performance, organizational learning, the increase of agility, organizations' ability to respond to changing environments. And that doesn't happen simply by focusing on individuals in order to get them up. You need to focus on all things. 70-20-10 is also a tool, as I mentioned, to refocus from learning to performance, which is what really matters. And it's a mindset. And a lot of the work we do, we have a three-level journey, which starts with the inspiration phase. We need to get people to understand. And as my colleague, former colleague, many of you will know, Jay Cross, who lived across the bay in Berkeley, who wrote a tremendous book called Informal Learning about 10 years ago. Jay always said, the problem that we have, Charles, is that many people, many managers, can't separate learning from schooling. When they think about learning, they think about schooling. And we know that we need to think differently. We need to have a new mindset in order to support learning where most of it happens, which is part of the workflow. And one of the uncomfortable truths about all this, and it's a truth that 70-20-10 is built upon, and there's some very good research. IBM did some great research about 10 or 12 years ago in this, and it's this: learning is likely to be more effective the closer to the point of use that it occurs. It's worthwhile saying that again. The closer to the point of use that you can provide support or learning, the more effective it's likely to be. Now that's quite a challenge for those of us that might spend our time creating our learning paths and our learning content and taking people away from their work in order to learn, to then go back into work in order to implement that learning. And I can recall when I was an undergraduate at Sydney University in Australia, sitting an exam, and we had a blackout. The lights went out. We just started to write this exam, and after a while the head invigilator stood up and said, "I'm sorry, this is a general blackout. We're going to have to collect your scripts. The exam will be rewritten, and you will have to resit it at the end of the exam period, about 2 or 3 weeks later." And this was November in Sydney, just coming into summer. The surf was getting out. All of us are really not terribly interested in having to wait another 2 or 3 weeks. And I recall very clearly walking into the quadrangle at Sydney University, staying with friends, and all of us saying, "This is terrible. We're going to have to learn all this stuff again." So we knew, and all of us know, that a lot of the learning in terms of the structured learning is nothing to do with learning. It's about short-term memory recall. All of us have been through there. All of us have been there. You know, we've got through our university courses with short-term memory. I mean, I went to my undergraduate degree was through the late 60s, early 70s. You know, Flower Power, Vietnam War, all that sort of stuff. There was lots more interesting things to do than study. So I became really good at being able to live on 3 hours sleep, stay up until 4 o'clock in the morning, go in, do that exam, and come out and forget the whole lot. So the point is that learning is likely to occur best when it's close to the point of use. Now we have technologies. Lots of people in this room work for organizations that are providing technologies and methodologies and approaches that are bringing learning and working closer together. And I guess if I was to preach anything, I would say that is probably the most important thing that we can do. We can actually start to bring that, or we can continue to bring learning and working and make them so integrated that it's difficult to tell the difference. So we need a new focus on people development. And this little diagram was done by a chap who heard me speak at one point, and I think it's pulled out the essence of the message I would give, which is when we look at how humans learn and how we learn effectively in 4 ways. We learn through rich and challenging experiences. We learn through increasing scopes of work. We learn through our failures and our mistakes. We learn through our successes. We learn through practice. Not one of us here would think that someone like Serena Williams doesn't practice between Grand Slams. Any sports person, when you look at that type of high performance, it's obvious that practice is really critical. We learn through creative conversations and building networks. Rob Cross at the University of Virginia, probably the world expert on social network analysis, has carried out work to show that that managers who are leaders in organizations who are better connected are about 20% more effective and also have better well-being than other people. So, again, going back to Jay Cross, Jay once said, conversation is the greatest learning technology ever invented. So we need to think about that. And lastly, reflection is critical. And I love Raoul's session this morning where we just take a bit of time out to reflect on what we've done. It's really critical. And many of us work in environments where the speed is so fast that we think we don't have time to reflect. In fact, none of us have time not to reflect, because reflection is really critical. If we look at some areas of work where reflection really works well, if you look at, for example, the military, the US military's after-action reviews, where they can take 2 minutes out in the heat of battle and say, what do we set out to do? What happened? Why did it happen? What do we do next time? Simple things like that, reflection, are really, really critical in order to do that. So I'd just like to finish with a couple of observations from two more Nobel Prize winning economists who've looked at learning in great detail. And the first is Kenneth Arrow. And Kenneth Arrow said, learning is a product of experience. Learning can only take place through attempts to solve a problem, and therefore only takes place during activity. And one of Arrow's students, and many of you will know Joseph Stiglitz. Stiglitz has written a wonderful book called Creating the Learning Society. I would recommend it if you're not an economist. It's pretty heavy going, but it's wonderful. And Stiglitz says, we learn by doing. We learn how to produce more efficiently, and by producing, more efficiently by producing, and as we produce, we observe how we can do it more efficiently. I would argue it's not just about efficiency, it's about effectiveness as well. So there's this virtuous cycle of doing, reflecting, practicing, new experiences, learning, doing better. And 70-20-10, the approach is really a methodology which helps organizations do that, move away from the model of learning, being separate from work, to actually integrating them and bringing them together. Thank you very much.